Right. This talk was inspired by two exhibitions of Gauguin's work, Gauguin Portrait at the National Gallery and Gauguin and the Impressionists at the Royal Academy. And what I'm going to do is, although it was inspired by those, it's not directly based on those exhibitions. I'm going to take you through his life, roughly chronologically, and at each stage of his life, I'm going to show some representative works. Now, Gauguin is, I believe, a misunderstood artist because we often associate him with the Tahitian period and his figure groups as Tahitian figure groups. He's also a contentious person to deal with because of his misogyny, racism, paedophilia. But let's take it a step at a time. Let's start at the beginning. Now this, what you see here, is a self-portrait of, his full name was Eugene Henri Paul Gauguin. He painted this self-portrait when he was about 28. And at that time, he was still an amateur artist, and he didn't become professional artist until about 4 years later, when he was 34. And he died when he was 54. So there was 20 years as a professional artist, and it was the last 12 of those years that he was in or around Tahiti. Now, in his lifetime, he wasn't recognized as a leading artist, but thanks to his dealer, Ambroise Vollard, who organized two important posthumous exhibitions, he became, quite quickly, he became recognized as a leading post-impressionist artist shortly after his death. Now, let's go back to the beginning. He was born in Paris in 1848, and you might be aware that 1848 was the year of revolutions across Europe, including in Paris. And this had an immediate impact on his family because, I won't go into it, but his father had to flee France with the family to Peru. And Peru was where his mother's family lived, which is why they went there. His father died on the journey of a heart attack, but his mother, Gauguin, who was still a baby, and his sister, who was, I think, about a year older, were welcomed by his mother's family. Now, this is his mother. She was a beautiful half Peruvian woman who died, in fact, 25 years before he painted this portrait. And he based the painting on an old photograph. I think I did some research. I think it's possibly this photograph that he based it on. But he's given the work a sort of devotional image here with its gold background and direct gaze. And it was painted long after his mother died, as I said, just before his first visit to Tahiti. And it was at that point that he was starting to explore the themes of womanhood and fertility. Now, going back to the visit to Peru, his mother's family were rich and powerful. His grandmother was the illegitimate daughter of a Peruvian aristocrat. And so Gauguin lived a life of luxury there until he was 6. And he clearly remembered his life there all of his life. Now, the family fell from political power, and Gauguin, his mother, grandmother, sister, returned to France, where his mother had to get a job as a dressmaker. And Gauguin was brought up by his grandmother, who he idolized. And she was a major influence in his life. He kept her books with him until the end of his life. Now, from the age of 11 to 16, he studied at a Catholic seminary, where one of the teachers there was the Bishop of Orleans. The seminary was just outside Orleans. And the bishop devised a catechism, which was, where does humanity come from? Where is it going to? And how does humanity proceed? And it was the where question that lodged in his mind. and informed his art, as we shall see later. But he didn't become an artist then. He was interested in art, but he joined a naval college when he was 16, signed up for 3 years, was transferred to India. And it was when he was living in India that received a letter from his sister telling him that his mother had died. So in 1871, when he was 23, he returned to Paris, and a close friend of the family got him a job as a stockbroker, a good job. For the next 11 years, he was a successful businessman. Now, it's difficult to translate earnings, but it was roughly, it was the equivalent of him earning about £200,000 a year in today's terms. Part of that was his salary, part was his dealings on the stock market, and part dealings in the art market. So then at that time, he was a stockbroker, but he was a keen amateur painter, and he painted the self-portrait that we saw just now. He became friends at this time with Camille Pissarro and exhibited at the Impressionist exhibition of 1881 and 1882, but the critics dismissed his work. He was unknown, but it was bought, one of his works was bought by the dealer Paul Gauguin. So when the stock market crashed in 1882, he decided to become an artist full-time. But I'll come back to that, because stepping back a few years, he married this woman, Mady. And he was still a wealthy stockbroker at this time. He fell in love with Mady and married her, Mady Sophie Gadd, who was a Danish woman from a middle-class Danish family. Her father was a judge. They had 5 children. The first was born a year after they married, Emile, and their last child was born 11 years later. As I said, he started collecting Impressionist work. He became a friend of Camille Pissarro, and it was Camille Pissarro who influenced his painting style at this time. And in fact, it was thanks to Pissarro that he got invited to exhibit at the Impressionist exhibition. And he spent, in fact, the summer of one of those years and learning from Pissarro, who was his mentor. And Pissarro, as you know, was known as the father of Impressionism. So he had a strong sort of influence of the Impressionist school. Now, in 1877, he moved from his apartment in Paris to a cheaper area just across the river, and he bought a house. But the family, he was a wealthy stockbroker, the family lived in style with servants, comfortable house with a garden, and he set up a studio in the house, which is where he painted this life-size portrait of a pregnant model called Suzanne. And it was painted in his studio in 1880, the same year, incidentally, as the previous painting you saw of his wife. Now, by combining a nude with a domestic scene, she's sewing, of everyday life, he removed the normally sort of idealization and eroticism associated with the nude figure, and it caused a big impact at the Impressionist exhibition, and it received positive reviews, or in fact, it received some positive reviews, but he was still unable to sell it. His wife, Mady, refused to allow it to be hung in the house. And in fact, later, she took it with her when she lived in Copenhagen and sold it to an artist later who donated it to the National Museum, which is where it hangs today. It illustrates also one of the influences on his work. There's many influences, which I'll mention some of them in passing, but he was influenced, one of his favorite painters was Jean-Auguste Ingres, and it's this painting, Study of a Nude, Suzanne sewing, is influenced by the this painting by Ingres of the Valpassant, the Valpassant bather, and also the Turkish bath, you might know, by Ingres, which shows one of the nudes in the bath is playing a mandolin, and you can see there's a mandolin hanging behind Suzanne in Gauguin's painting. So these are all honoring references to one of his favorite painters. Now, this is the area where he lived, Vaugirard, near his house. We think of him as a Tahitian painter, but in fact, at this time, he painted a large number of landscapes, many still lifes, including flower paintings, and probably landscapes was the most common thing he painted. But at this time, he was still self-taught or Pissarro-taught Sunday painter, an amateur painter. You can see the brushstrokes influence by Pissarro, and snow scenes are also popular with the Impressionists. They painted a lot, I think partly because it allowed the subtle color variations to be expressed. These transitions you can see in this painting from a sort of purple to bluish shades. But later, Gauguin broke with this Impressionist style and developed his own style, which then in fact evolved again. But it was at this period, a few years later in 1882, as I've already mentioned, that the stock market crashed. The Paris Bourse, the stock market, collapsed. It was brought about by the collapse of a bank. It was the worst financial crisis in the French economy in the 19th century. Gauguin lost his job and most of his savings, which were invested. He had to move house with his family to Rouen, where the cost of living was much lower. Suddenly, they went from a comfortable upper middle class existence to no income and living on their meager remaining savings. A couple of photographs. He, at this time, because he couldn't get a job, decided to become a full-time artist. Also, he thought he could become successful as an artist, but found it difficult to sell his own work and started to sell his art collection. Now, Mady, his wife, became dissatisfied and in due course moved back to her parents' house in Copenhagen with the children. These are the children. This shows Mady with the children. She later returned to Rouen, where Gauguin was still living. She'd left with the children to return to her parents, and she managed to convince him to join her in Copenhagen. And he found a job there, which was commission only, tarpaulin salesman of all things, to make some money. But needless to say, he failed completely. I mean, he didn't speak Danish and no one wanted French tarpaulins. So the chief breadwinner at this time became his wife, who, with the help of her family and their connections, she managed to build up and give French lessons to trainee diplomats, which was well paid. But tensions grew. She was the breadwinner. He wasn't earning any money. His job was unsuccessful. Tensions developed between the two of them, and particularly with his in-laws. And eventually, his wife and her family asked him to leave. We don't know, but I would assume asking him to go back to Paris and get a job. He returned to Paris. He took his 6-year-old son, Clovis. Clovis is the one on the far left. Remember, I mentioned Emile was the firstborn, the boy on the right. Aline was his favorite daughter, who died young when he was in Tahiti. And then the other two, Jean René, became a sculptor, and Paul Roland, who became known as Paul Gauguin, became a painter, quite well-known painter in Denmark, and art critic. Remember, he was still trying to earn a living as a full-time artist, but for 3 years he almost sold no work, the odd work here and there. And after he'd left Mady, they never lived together as husband and wife again. But he continued to write her letters for the remaining 23 years of his life. And he traveled around and painted, and they saw each other only once more in 1891. So here he was in Paris with no money, with his son, when Clovis fell ill. But luckily, Gauguin's sister, remember I mentioned the sister he went with to Peru, paid for Clovis to be treated, and then she paid for him to be sent to boarding school. Now, Gauguin produced little art during this period, although this is one work which shows his style is starting to change. He did exhibit paintings. He exhibited 19 paintings at the last Impressionist exhibition, which was held in 1886, but he only sold one painting there. At that time, it was Seurat. Georges Seurat was becoming seen as the leader of the avant-garde movement, but Gauguin rejected completely his pointillist technique. And the same year, in fact, as the exhibition, he broke with his friend Pissarro. He went off and spent the summer at Pont Ven in Brittany, as it was cheaper to live there. And it was a sort of developing artist colony. The people who lived there were fervently religious, and it was a long way from the sophistication of Paris, which energized Gauguin. He loved this rural, what he called primitive culture. Let me just explain. The term primitive was used at the time to refer to any culture outside the sophisticated capitals of Europe. It might be used to refer to, as here, a rural village like Pont Ven. It might refer to Arab, African, or Asian culture, or an earlier period, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, excluding, of course, the classical period. But you need to understand that for Gauguin and many other artists, it was a term of praise. Primitive meant closer to nature, more honest, more energetic, and without the hypocrisy of middle-class society. So perhaps the word genuine that we use today is closer to what Gauguin meant by the word primitive. And he was energized in Pont Ven and forged this new style. This painting, Women Bathing, is transitional. It's partway between his old style, which you saw, and his new style. And it was at this point that he started to see that he could use color not to imitate nature, not to mimic nature, but for its emotional qualities. He dressed outlandishly. He was older than most of the young art students who were there, and he became a bit of a leader amongst the art students. He made friends with the artist Charles Laval, and who accompanied him to Martinique, as we shall see. And it became fashionable amongst the young artists, encouraged by Gauguin, to be inspired by African and Asian art because of its energy and symbolism. Another example of a nude he painted at Pont Ven. Mostly he painted landscapes. The reason I'm showing this one is because it's clearly indebted to another one of the artists that influenced him, and that's Degas. This is Degas the Tub. It was one of 7 pictures that Degas painted exploring the theme of women washing. It was exhibited at the final Impressionist exhibition where, as I said, Gauguin also exhibited. And it was unlike any previous scenes that people had seen of ladies at their toilette, which were mostly idealized nudes. This is well, it was described by critics at the time as animal-like, an animal-like pose, which reminded them of the crouching Venus of antiquity that you might have seen in the British Museum. Another work he painted at Pont Ven, which is in southern Brittany. And it was an area where, to use that word again that Gauguin used, a primitive way of life was followed, which really inspired Gauguin. I should mention that the other influence on young artists in Pont Ven was a British artist. This artist, Rodolphe Caldicott, who painted these sort of naive drawings of the area, and we see here it was popular for tourists as well, for travel brochures. And this style influenced the young artists, including Gauguin, this simple style. It also influenced Emile Bernard and Van Gogh, although Van Gogh didn't visit Pont Ven. But as I said, it was Gauguin who emerged as the intellectual leader of the young artists, and Gauguin developed a style which is called synthetisme, or often in English it's pronounced as synthetism, and it's recognized by its use of bold colors, rhythmic lines, and its simplified two-dimensional forms. We'll see some examples in a moment. It's a sort of a decorative style that synthesized, brought together the subject matter with the artist's feelings to invoke a mood. Well, as I said, he became friends with Pierre Lavelle, and they, let's move on to the next slide, they were enticed in a way to Panama, where the Panama Canal was being built at that time, with the offer of lucrative jobs. But when they got there, they found there were no jobs, and they'd used up all their money to get there. So they had to work as laborers digging the Panama Canal in terrible conditions, and they struggled to earn enough to get a boat to Martinique. Unfortunately, I mean, they earned enough money. They arrived at Martinique, which was like a paradise to them. But unfortunately, when he arrived, he caught dysentery, and he only managed to produce some 12 paintings in Martinique, including this one. And he was excited by the exotic location. His work started to become more brightly colored, loosely painted, more set outside. And it was here that he became inspired by finding an unspoilt culture with its exoticism and sensuality. And although at this point he wasn't thinking of Tahiti specifically, he was searching for an unspoilt culture to live in. But he found Martinique had already been, in his view, spoiled by Western missionaries and colonial rule. So he tried, when he was there, to find isolated locations like this one, where he could invent his own primitive world. Notice how much his style has changed, incidentally, since Garden Under Snow, that impressionist painting we saw earlier. And as I said, he was dreaming of escaping from urban civilization and immersing himself in some tropical paradise where he could feel closer to nature. And he believed that he would be closer to the truth, the beginnings of humanity, and it would be more mysterious, which appealed to his imagination, but also more sensuous. But at this time, he returned from Martinique and exhibited his work in Paris. It was admired by Vincent van Gogh and by his brother Theo, or Theo, if you prefer, who was a leading art dealer in Paris. And Theo purchased 3 works of Gauguin's and introduced him to wealthy clients. Gauguin, incidentally, seems particularly hard for Gauguin to modify his behavior and to benefit from the introductions that he got. Gauguin and Vincent became close friends at this time. They corresponded, and Gauguin helped him develop a personal theory of art. Vincent hero worshipped Gauguin and dreamt of setting up a studio of the South. He went down to Arles, and then Theo convinced Gauguin to visit Vincent's yellow house in Arles by paying him an allowance. And of course, Theo was also an important art dealer in Paris. Gauguin was indifferent. And because of his indifference, and also mainly because of their fundamental disagreement about art, their relationship changed, and hero worship on Vincent's part turned into anger. Their disagreement was that Van Gogh thought that the artist should confront nature directly, go out to nature, represent nature, sit in front of nature. And Gauguin didn't think that was necessary at all. He thought that artists should work from their imagination, which was fundamentally wrong to Van Gogh. And we'll see later that although his early work was painted from nature, Gauguin's later work was all developed out of his imagination. In fact, the next painting we'll see illustrates that well. I won't go into detail about what happened between them and the famous story of Van Gogh cutting off his ear, but I will just read to you an account that Gauguin wrote sometime after he went for a walk in one of the public gardens in Arles. He wrote, "I heard behind me a well-known step, short, quick, irregular. I turned about the instant that Vincent rushed towards me, an open razor in his hand. My look at that moment must have had great power in it, for he stopped and, lowering his head, set off running towards home." Well, that's Gauguin's view of what happened. Who knows what actually happened, but we do know Vincent did cut off his ear, a large part of his ear, wrapped it in newspaper, handed it to a woman who worked in the local brothel, which they both frequented, with instructions to hand it to a shy young prostitute called Rachel. Vincent was hospitalized the next day, and Gauguin left Arles, and they never saw each other again. But although they continued to correspond with each other, and Gauguin shortly later proposed setting up a studio in Antwerp, although that never happened. So this is the painting I referred to just now. It's one of perhaps Gauguin's best known paintings. And you can see here his use of these flat areas of color, unusual perspective, clearly a work of the imagination. In fact, it's a work from Gauguin's imagination, representing the imagination of a group of villagers of Pont Ven. And it shows them having left the church after a sermon they heard from Genesis that told the story of Jacob fording a river with his family and then spending the whole night wrestling with a person who it turns out was a mysterious angel. And in the letter Gauguin wrote to Van Gogh, he said, "For me, the landscape and the fight only exist in the imagination of the people praying after the sermon." He uses the diagonal tree to separate the real world, or in fact, the world of his imagination, from the world of their imagination, imagining the story they've just heard from the Bible. The style, incidentally, is closely related to Japanese prints by Hiroshige and Hokusai that we know Gauguin possessed and was influenced by. Now, it was at this time that I said he was recognized as one of the, or as the leader of the art colony in Pont Ven, and he developed a style that he called synthetisme, or in English we pronounce it synthetism, which combined natural forms with the artist's feeling, and it was closely associated with another technique that he developed with Émile Bernard, which was called or named by a critic cloisonnism, where there's areas of color separated by dark lines. We can see it in this painting. And it was called cloisonnism because it was related to cloisonner, which is, as you probably know, a technique of soldering wires to a base and then filling the areas with colored powdered glass, which then when you fire, the glass melts, and so you get different colored areas of flat color surrounded by black lines. Now, as we've seen, many of Gauguin's paintings have a religious theme. He was brought up, he went to a Catholic seminary, he was brought up as Catholic. He was Catholic by inclination, although he was not a typical Catholic. He had big issues with the Catholic Church. So he had his own form of Catholicism, and this is the Yellow Christ, also painted in this style of this called cloisonism, which he developed with Émile Bernard and others. Cloisonism and synthetism were closely related, and I think a quote helps here. It was slightly late, in 1890, Maurice Denis wrote the following: "It is well to remember that a picture, before being a battle horse, a nude woman, or some anecdote, is essentially a flat surface covered with colors assembled in a certain order." In other words, what he was saying was that it reminds us, or painting in this way, or let us paint in a way that reminds us of the physicality of the painted surface, because that's all it is, colors on a flat plane, and its decorative qualities. Let's not be influenced by the subject matter. Let's just see it as a decorative collection of colors, while at the same time seeing it as invoking a subject with its many meanings. So it's combining the two seamlessly, if you like, both as a decorative surface and as a subject with its many meanings. I've already mentioned the influence of Edgar Degas, but I thought I'd mention it again, as it was an influence throughout his life. And this is a much later painting. In fact, it's one of his last paintings, Riders on the Beach, painted in 1902. He died in 1903. But the reason I'm showing it is that you might know this painting by Degas, Racehorses Before the Stands, and you can see how closely related or inspired Gauguin was even late in his life. And in fact, he was a friend of Degas. He admired Degas personally, his artistic dignity and tact, as Gauguin described it. And unusually for Gauguin, he managed to retain a healthy friendship with Degas that spanned his entire artistic career. They remained friends the whole of Gauguin's life. Now, Degas admired Gauguin's work and persuaded the dealer, the well-known and influential dealer Durand-Ruel, to do the same, to buy his work. And Ruel held an exhibition in 1893, which received mixed reviews. It was in fact mocked by Monet. Gauguin was mocked by Monet, Renoir, and his former friend Pizarro, but it was praised by Degas. Degas was a bit outside the clique, if you like. He was an artist in his own right. This painted by Gauguin was painted in the last island that he lived on, Hivuoa, pronounced Hivaoa. And the two ghostly riders appear to be blocking the path of three horsemen riding along the beach. Well, now we move to Tahiti. By 1890, Gauguin had conceived the idea, decided that he would make Tahiti his next artistic project. He raised money by selling a few paintings. He managed to sell a few. He held a banquet and charged people, held a benefit concert. He visited his wife and children in Copenhagen to say goodbye. It turned out to be the last time he saw them, except the last time he saw them. And he set sail on the 1st of April, 1891, promising everyone he would return a rich man, because he believed that Tahiti would inspire his art and he would find an honest culture uncorrupted by civilization, and this would inspire him to produce his best works yet. I should mention that when he left for Tahiti, he left behind his pregnant 20-year-old mistress, Juliette Huet. So I haven't said in any of this that Gauguin was a nice person. In fact, the opposite, I think. His idea was to escape from everything that is artificial and conventional about European art and produce a new type of art. However, when he arrived, he was disappointed. He found that the capital, Papeete, was as much, or some people call it Parpete, was much influenced by French and European culture. And in fact, it was expensive as well. He couldn't afford to live there. So he moved to a bamboo hut 28 miles away and painted the Tahitian lifestyle, or the Tahitian lifestyle as he interpreted it, as he saw it. And this is the first major picture he painted based on a Christian theme. It's called Hail Mary. And in a letter, and Gauguin wrote a lot of letters, he describes it as an angel with yellow wings. You can see on the left there, the angel reveals Mary and Jesus on the right there with halos, both Tahitians, to two Tahitian women. And then he goes on to describe the picture further and says at the end, I'm rather happy with it. In other words, it's a picture he liked. He was also, the composition was inspired by a photograph he owned of a Javanese temple. So it's an unusual combination of composition of a Javanese temple, Catholic symbolism, and Tahitian subject matter. Now, many of his finest paintings date from this period. This is Woman with a Flower, but he also painted By the Sea, and they all had Tahitian titles as well. And I don't know how to pronounce Tahitian, but this painting is Vahini no Te Tiare, I assume. He painted a painting called Ave Maria, all in, and others, all in 1891. In other words, he was inspired by the surroundings he found there. He sent this painting to a friend in Paris. It was displayed at the Goupil Gallery. He read books on Tahitian culture. He produced some 20 paintings, a dozen wood carvings. I'm not going to show you, I will have one slide about his wood carvings, but that's a separate subject in itself. He was inspired by the culture, or at least the culture as he studied it, as he imagined it. excuse me, he sent 9 paintings then back to Paris, and he was told, unfortunately in a way, he was told they had been very well received, but in fact critics compared them unfavorably with the work of Van Gogh, and they didn't sell. But when he ran out of money, Gauguin was encouraged by what he thought was his success in Paris, and he returned with 70 more works that he carried with him on the journey. And in fact, he didn't have any money, so he got state support and a free passage back home. And he was, by this time, starting to suffer from health problems. I'll talk more about his health problems in a moment. So relatively successful in his own terms, and inspired by the Tahitian culture, and had developed, as you see here, his late style, if you like. Returned, thinking he was a success in Paris, he returned with 70 works back to Paris. He wrote a travelogue at this time called Noah Noah, a book you can buy on Amazon if you wish, describing his experiences. And he revealed in the book that he had married. People say that the marriage vows he took, because he was still married to Maidie, narrowly avoid bigamy. So you could say that he married a 13-year-old girl, or that she became his lover. She was called Teha Amana, and he called her in his letters Tehura, and she gave birth. And it was then he left for Paris, and he never saw her or the child again. Although he did return to Tahiti, he never visited her. But she was the subject of a number of paintings, including this famous painting, Spirit of the Dead Watching. Gauguin wrote in a letter that he came home one night to find her in this position, with her eyes wide open with fear. And so Gauguin painted from his imagination this painting of her with what is either a ghost or an old woman seated behind her. And he said in the letter that the title, Spirit of the Dead Watching, may refer either to the girl imagining the ghost or the ghost imagining the girl. He wrote also to Maidie, his wife, describing this painting, although he never mentioned that the girl was his lover. In fact, he implied the opposite. And this painting was described, I think accurately, by one art historian as a veritable encyclopedia of colonial racism and misogyny. And it's been suggested by another historian that when he came home, the fear in the eyes of Teha Amana was in fact fear of being beaten by Gauguin. And it's been documented that his aggressive behavior towards women is consistent with the physical abuse of his wife. Now, when he went to Tahiti, or French Polynesia, it was believed by many art historians, later art historians, that he had syphilis, which he gave to the girl. However, there's an interesting twist to that, because recently, in fact, in 2014, they found 4 molar teeth down a well, believe it or not, near the house he lived in. And DNA analysis of the teeth showed that they were Gauguin's teeth. Further analysis of the teeth showed they had no trace of mercury in them, and mercury was then the standard treatment for syphilis. So the implication of that is that he didn't actually have syphilis, but he had similar symptoms, which is what led people to believe that he did have syphilis. I just leave the evidence that we have with you to form your own conclusion. He returned to Paris, where he continued to paint from his imagination Tahitian scenes. He had an exhibition held by Joanne Ruel, which was a moderate success. He adopted an exotic persona. He wore Polynesian dress, for example. He held a weekly salon, and he conducted a public affair with a teenager we see here called Anna the Javanese. But at this point, disaster struck him professionally for reasons we don't know, although I imagine it was one of the many arguments he had. He lost the patronage of Joanne Ruel, his main route to market, the only person that seemed to be able to sell his work, which meant he didn't have access to the American market, which Joanne Ruel was just opening up, and which the Americans were just starting to buy any Impressionist work at elevated prices. Gauguin tried to hold an exhibition himself, but it was a failure. And it was at this time, that 1893, that he inherited 13,000 francs from his uncle, but he only gave his wife 1,500 francs. There was a massive argument. All hopes of reconciliation vanished. They quarreled over the money. Neither visited the other, and they separated the following year. Although, in fact, Gauguin continued to write to her. He went back. Well, in fact, he had to raise funds first because he didn't sell enough paintings. But a friend managed to arrange a cheap passage back to Tahiti, and he never saw Europe again. He returned at a low ebb. Critics in Paris had attacked his work, and he became disillusioned with the Paris art scene. In fact, for many years, he believed that he was like a Christ-like figure who was reviled unfairly by the world. That was one of the reasons that he left the sort of social scene of Paris, because he felt that he wasn't understood, and he felt that he could achieve more in another culture. Well, he arrived 3 months later in 1895 and spent the next 6 years living, as far as we can tell, comfortably as an artist settler near the capital, Papeete. And he had a slow but steady stream of sales to friends. But he also at one point took a desk job in the capital. He built a thatched house with a large studio in a wealthy area, just 10 miles from the capital. He owned a horse and trap. He took the Mercure de France. He engaged in a lively correspondence with artists, dealers, critics, and patrons in Paris. He played a lively role in local government politics. He wrote for a local newspaper called The Wasps, and he attacked the governor, colonial government, and eventually he became editor of The Wasps. So he was part of the social scene in the capital. He produced a few sculptures, but no paintings. But eventually he resumed painting, and he painted this work of Christian symbolism, Son of God, or the birth. And he was now painting mostly for his fellow colonists who were buying his work rather than the avant-garde in Paris. He was hospitalized several times, partly because of an ankle injury he received in a pub brawl. He got into a fight, and the ankle injury never healed properly. So he had debilitating sores that opened up on his leg. We don't know. He described it as eczema. It may have been related to the ankle injury. Later art historians put it down to syphilis, but as I've already told you, forensic analysis suggests that he didn't have syphilis. It was during this period that he began a relationship with this woman, Pahura, when she was 14, and she fathered 2 of his children. One of them died, but the other, a son, she raised. And in fact, his descendants still live in Tahiti. And this is perhaps his most famous painting. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Which might remind you of the catechism I mentioned given by the Bishop of Orléans at the seminary he attended as a teenager. It was in April 1897, the year this was painted, that he received news his favourite daughter, a lion, had died. He had to vacate the house he lived in as the land, he didn't own the land, and the land was sold. He took out a loan, he built a much bigger house, but the loan was too big. It had beautiful views, but he'd overextended himself. The bank threatened to foreclose on him. His health was failing. Debts were pressing down on him. He was on the brink of despair when he completed this work, which he regarded as his masterpiece and final artistic statement. In fact, he wrote in a letter that he tried to kill himself at this point because he regarded all of his debts, his condition, his physical condition, and the fact that he just painted what he regarded as his final masterpiece. I mean, there's a lot I could say about this painting, but just briefly, the group on the right represents the beginning of life. You can see the baby and the women bringing up the child. The middle group, the daily life of young adulthood. The woman in the center picking a fruit is a reference to Eve. And the group on the left, Gauguin wrote, shows how an old woman approaching death appears reconciled and resigned to her thoughts. At her feet, a strange white bird represents the futility of words and the uselessness of vain words. Remember, I'm quoting from Gauguin's letter. So overall, from right to left, it represents the cycle of birth, sin, and death. And outside this cycle, the blue idol in the background, Gauguin said in the letter, represents the beyond. It was exhibited with other paintings in Paris. It was a mild success, and eventually it sold in 1901 for 2,500 francs. But at this point, a Paris dealer, Vollard, agreed to pay Gauguin 300 francs a month against 25 unseen paintings a year, and Vollard also provided the art materials needed. So 300 francs a month meant that he could live, but not live exotically. Another disconcerting painting, this is Nevermoor. It combines beauty and eroticism, and it of course, to the modern eye, gives a strong feeling of unease, to say the least. It's intended to provide unease, but for different reasons. The young woman on the bed is anxiously aware of the bird and the strange beings behind her, who Gauguin wrote may be evil spirits. But it's, for modern viewers, it's the youth of the nude figure, sometimes identified as his 15-year-old partner Pahura, that's the most unsettling aspect of this. It's associated that the title Nevermoor is associates the painting with Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven, with the Nevermore line in it, repeated endlessly by the raven. Some people have said there's a sense of loss that this illustrates Gauguin's disillusionment with the destruction of Tahitian culture by the French authorities, because, as I said before, he didn't find an unspoilt paradise that he'd imagined. He found a society that he believed had been corrupted by decades of colonialism and missionary work. Although, of course, that didn't prevent him taking advantage of exactly that, his position as a European colonizer. And Pahura was one of several teenagers he took on as, quotes, wives. And in fact, this helped, he helped spread this fantasy, this racist fantasy of Tahitian girls being sexually precocious, which led to others unabashedly exploiting them. On a slightly different note, Gauguin was critical of the exaggerated difference between the sexes in Europe, this strong distinction between you're either a man or you're a woman, and the two are completely different, society at the time believed. But Gauguin didn't believe. He praised the Tahitian view of the androgyny of the sexes, which he admired. In fact, when he first arrived, he was called Tata Vahine, man, woman, because of his shoulder length hair that he had at the time. And it was assumed he was what they called a mahu, which was what we would call a male transvestite. And you can see an example of a mahu here, Marquesan man in a red cape. And you'll also notice that a lot of Gauguin's women are intentionally soft masculine figures. That is, they're painted with solid arms, heavy thighs, and masculine calves. And also a lot of the men he paints are feminized. He saw it as a spectrum rather than a clear difference between the sexes. I said that I'd have one slide of his carving, and I haven't got a slide of his ceramic work. In fact, in the island he finally lived in had no clay, so he started carving. The figure, this incidentally is what we now call primitivism, which is an art style. Normally associated with Picasso and his Mademoiselles d'Avignon. But in fact, it was Gauguin who was one of the first to develop this style of exaggerated figures, animal totems, geometric designs, stark contrasts. And both Picasso and Gauguin were inspired by the raw power on simplicity, on the honest art of foreign cultures, which they at the time called primitive, which I've already explained. And we see two here. The one on the left is his young Tahitian lover or wife, his first one, Taha Amana. And the one on the right, amusingly, is a statuette of Bishop Martin, who he's lampooning here as Father Lechery because of his affairs with local women. Gauguin had two posthumous exhibitions, as I mentioned, in Paris in 1903 and 1906, and it was those that had a powerful influence on French avant-garde art and on Pablo Picasso in particular. So Gauguin was influenced by many artists, as many artists are, from Giotto, Raphael, Ingres, I've mentioned, Delacroix, I haven't really mentioned, Manet, Degas, of course, and Cézanne, and also by the philosopher he wrote of Arthur Schopenhauer, and the poet Stéphane Mallarmé. So with a regular income from Vollard, his dealer in Paris, he was able to move to the Marquesas Islands, which are sort of, well, they're in Polynesia, but they're about 1,000 miles from Tahiti, which is where he spent his final months in relative comfort. Now, Pahura didn't come to the island with him. It was too far from her family. And it was on the Marquesas Islands that he couldn't continue his ceramic work because there was no clay on the islands, and he did a lot more wood sculpture. The islands had been ravaged by European diseases. The population had shrunk from something like 80,000 to 4,000. Catholic missionaries were in control of the island. All the children attended missionary school until their teens. And Gauguin settled near the capital of the islands. It was small, it was a small population. There was no hospital. There was a single military doctor, but the doctor, shortly after he arrived, the doctor left the island, and Gauguin, remember Gauguin had physical problems. He had to rely on 2 healthcare workers and his friends. He built a 2-story house on the island that included a studio, and to begin with, he held parties every night for the locals. And this upset his relationship with the bishop, who initially he got on well with, but their friendship broke down completely. It took a turn for the worst when he produced that statue I've just shown you, which shows refers to the bishop's reputed mistress, and he attacked the missionary school system. Many teenage daughters were withdrawn from the school, and one of these was a girl who he called Mary Rose, the 14-year-old daughter of a native couple who became his mistress, and she gave birth to a daughter, again, whose descendants still live on the island. Well, in the partying, he stopped the partying and there was a short productive period where he produced 20 paintings that he sent to Vollard in Paris. He painted mostly landscape, still life, figure paintings, and this self-portrait. He avoided the primitive and lost paradise themes because he was advised by Vollard that they wouldn't sell as well in Paris. Always contentious throughout his life. In 1903, the year of his death, he started a campaign against the local gendarmes for incompetence. It all arose from some probably misunderstanding, but the charges were investigated, couldn't be substantiated, and then the gendarmes sued him for libel. He was fined 300 francs and sentenced to 3 months in prison. He appealed. At this stage, he was extremely weak and in great pain. He was taking morphine every day, and he died suddenly of, I believe, a heart attack on the morning of the 8th of May. He was buried in the Catholic cemetery. Ironically, the next grave along is Bishop Martin, the one he had lampooned with the statuette. His effects, unfortunately, were quickly auctioned off, and we lost much valuable information about the latter period of his life. As I said, it was after his death that his dealer Vollard held 2 posthumous exhibitions, and his fame started to grow and grow. Many of his works were bought by Russian collectors living in Paris. They're now in the Pushkin Museum and the Hermitage. This work he produced earlier, 1892, but I'm showing it's called When Will You Marry? It's assumed that the woman behind is the mother looking at the young girl asking the question, when will you marry? But the reason I'm showing it to you is that it became the world's 3rd most expensive artwork when its owner sold it privately for $210 million in 2014. In fact, I think it was the most expensive artwork ever sold in 2014. It's believed the buyer, I think we now know the buyer is the Qatari Museum. And the last word I thought, in other words, he started to become famous. He became very influential after his death. Once he started to become famous, it influenced a number of other artists in the early 20th century. And I believe that it's best to end with some words that Gauguin wrote just before he died. I have wished to establish the right to dare. The public owes me nothing, since my achievement in painting is only relatively good. But the painters who today profit by this liberty, they owe me something. In other words, above all, he dared to be different. Thank you.